There are people in this world who carry their smile like a shield, and you would never know. Not from the stage lights, not from the sold-out arenas, not from the way his voice seems to find the part of your chest you didn't know needed touching. You look at him and you see the sharp jaw, the easy grin, the guitar hanging from his shoulder like it was born there. You think you know this man. Millions do, or think they do. But what happens when the person who has spent 30 years singing about love and loss and redemption has been living silently, with wounds that run so deep they nearly swallowed him whole? What happens when the voice the world turns to for comfort can barely find its own? And the real question, the one that sits underneath everything, is this: how does a man who had nothing, who lost everything, and who nearly destroyed himself in the process become the kind of person who can stand at 58 years old and make an entire arena full of strangers feel less alone? The answer is stranger, more painful, and more quietly beautiful than any song he has ever recorded. And it begins not in Nashville, not on a stage, but in a small, sun-scorched town in New Zealand where a little boy first learned what it felt like to be different. Robert Keithabon, the name he was born with on October 26, 1967, in Whangarei, New Zealand, did not grow up in the story you'd imagine for a man who would one day sell millions of records. His father, Bababon, was a man who ran a convenience store, a tobacconist shop really, in the kind of small Queensland, Australia town where dreams tend to stay quiet. His mother, Marianne, was a woman of warmth and patience, the kind of parent who lets a child believe the world might actually want what he has to offer. The family moved to Australia when Keith was just 2 years old, settling eventually in Caboolture, a working-class town north of Brisbane, the kind of place where the heat sits on your shoulders in January and the horizon always feels just slightly too far away. He was a child that didn't quite fit the mold. Not in the way troubled children don't fit, but in the way that gifted, restless children don't fit. He heard music differently. He felt rhythm in places others felt only silence. By the time he was 6 years old, he was already playing guitar. 6. Not in any prodigy on a stage sense, but in the way that some children pick up a language because it's the one that finally makes sense to them. The guitar was his first real language. His parents recognized it early and did something remarkable for a working-class family in 1970s Queensland. They invested. They found him a guitar teacher. They drove him to lessons. His mother, in particular, saw something in him that she refused to let the ordinary world smother. By the age of 9, Keith Urban was performing in public. Not in living rooms, in clubs, in bars, in roadhouses, in the kinds of venues where the cigarette smoke was thick enough to see and grown men clapped with calloused hands. He was 9 years old, this small Australian boy with the wide eyes and the guitar twice the size of his torso, and he was already learning what it felt like to hold a room. He competed in talent contests. He won them. His voice, even then, had that quality, something in it that sounded honest in a way that cuts through noise. He won the Lotto Star Quest Talent Competition in 1983. He was 15, still a boy in many ways, but already on a trajectory that felt bigger than Caboolture, bigger than Queensland, bigger than anything his small town had words for. But here's the thing about growing up the way Keith did, with one foot always in a world of music, of performance, of applause, and the other foot planted firmly in a home that was ordinary and struggling. You learn very early that love and approval are things you earn, not things that are simply given. And that lesson, absorbed in childhood, becomes a kind of ghost that follows you into every room you ever enter, every relationship you ever try to build, every stage you ever stand on. You're always, somewhere underneath it all, still that little boy performing for the approval of strangers, hoping they won't ask you to stop, hoping you are enough. The guitar. That guitar. It's important that you hold on to that image because it will come back. That instrument he first held as a 6-year-old child in Queensland. It is not just a tool. It is the through line. It is the thing he has returned to in every dark hour of his life. And it is the thing that has, every single time, told him who he was when he had forgotten WY's late teens. Keith Urban was good enough to be signed to a record label in Australia. He moved to Brisbane and began building a career with genuine momentum, gigging, recording, performing. He released music in Australia through the late 1980s, and he had Australian chart success, real success, the kind that makes other people in the industry start nodding at your name. He was forming a band, working furiously, honing his guitar, playing to a degree of technical brilliance that still makes other musicians stop mid-sentence when they talk about it. And then he did the thing that terrified him and excited him in equal measure. In 1992, at 24 years old, Keith Urban packed up and moved to Nashville. Nashville was not waiting for him. This is where many people, when they tell Keith Urban's story, skip past something important. They skip past the years. The actual years of nobody caring, nobody calling, nobody remembering his name after the meeting was over. He arrived in Nashville with his Australian accent and his Australian instincts and his extraordinary guitar work. And the city, which had seen 1,000 talented people walk through its doors before him, shrugged. He joined a band called The Ranch. They got a record deal with Capitol Records. They released an album in 1997. The album went almost nowhere. The band dissolved, and Keith Urban found himself in his late 20s in a city that still wasn't sure what to do with him, with a career that felt like it was made of sand. Now here is where the story splits into two tracks. The public track and the private track. The public track, in time, would show recovery, success, triumph. The private track, the one Keith has spoken about only in fragments, in interviews spread across decades, in quiet admissions that most people didn't fully hear. That track was running in a completely different direction. Because during these years in Nashville, during the grinding uncertainty and the professional rejection and the slow, corrosive feeling of not being enough, Keith Urban began drinking. And not in the casual, social, this is Nashville way that surrounds a music industry like weather. He was drinking to disappear. He was drinking the way people drink when they're trying to silence something inside themselves that they don't have words for yet. And underneath the drinking, and this is the part that doesn't get discussed enough, there was cocaine. A habit that crept up on him during these years of struggle and uncertainty and took hold with the particular viciousness that stimulants have for people who are already running from something. Here was a man who had been performing since he was 9 years old, who had built his entire identity on the ability to hold an audience, to be enough, to be worthy of the applause. And he was slowly dissolving in a city that hadn't made its mind up about him yet. The loneliness of Nashville in those years for Keith Urban was a specific and terrible kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being unknown. The loneliness of knowing exactly who you are, what you can do, how far you can go, and watching the world look right through you anyway. He checked into a rehabilitation center in 1998. It was his first attempt at sobriety. He was 30 years old. The world barely noticed because the world barely knew his name yet. He came out the other side of that stint with something that looked like clarity. He threw himself back into the work, and this time, Nashville was finally ready to listen. But before the listening, a pause. Because you need to understand the weight of what he was carrying into what came next. Rehabilitation is not a reset button. It is not a clean slate. It is more like surgery. The procedure is necessary. The healing is real, but the scar remains. Keith Urban walked back into Nashville in 1998 with his sobriety and his guitar and his extraordinary restless talent. And he was also carrying every year of silence, every rejection, every moment of numbing himself against the specific pain of a dream that wasn't arriving on schedule. He was carrying all of that. And somehow, against every odd, he was about to put all to music and make the world feel something. In 1999, Capitol Records Nashville signed Keith Urban as a solo artist. His debut American album, self-titled, was released that year. And then something happened that almost no one who has not experienced it can fully understand. The door opened. Not slowly, not with polite knocking. The door opened like a flood. The single, But for the Grace of God, reached #1 on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart in 2000. Then came You're Everything, another #1. Then, Where the Blacktop Ends, another #1. 3 consecutive #1 singles from a debut album, something that had not happened in country music since Dario in 1993. The industry that had looked through him for most of a decade was now watching his every move. The arenas started filling. The awards started coming. The Grammy nominations followed. Keith Urban, the boy from Caboolture with the guitar twice his size and the voice that sounded like it was made for honesty, had arrived. And not quietly. The years that followed were years of accumulation, of accolades, of tours, of records that kept finding their way to the top of charts. The album Golden Road, in 2002, was a commercial and critical triumph. Be Here, in 2004, sold over 2 million copies in the United States alone. He won Grammy Awards. He won CMA Awards multiple times. He won ACM Awards. He became a fixture at the top of country music. And then something larger happened. He began to transcend country music entirely. His guitar playing was being discussed alongside rock and pop conversations. His crossover appeal was genuine, not manufactured. He was appearing on television programs, in magazines, at events that had nothing to do with Nashville. He was becoming, without quite intending it, a global name. And then he met Nicole Kidman. The meeting happened in January 2005 at the Day USA Gala in Los Angeles, a function celebrating Australian talent in America. Two of Australia's most prominent exports in the same room. She was already one of the most famous actresses in the world, Academy Award winner, icon, a woman whose professional life had been conducted at a level of scrutiny that would have crushed most people. He was the country music star on the rise. And something happened between them, quickly, with a kind of certainty that both of them have spoken about in ways that suggest it surprised them. They were engaged by 2005. They married on June 25, 2006, in a chapel in Sydney. It was, by all visible accounts, the beginning of something genuinely beautiful. And then, for months later, Keith Urban checked himself into the Betty Ford Centerpoint 4 months. Let that land for a moment. 4 months into his marriage to the woman he had described as his rescue, his reason, his anchor, and the addiction that had never fully left came roaring back. He has talked about this moment in the years since with a rawness that is almost difficult to hear. He has said that he could not be the husband he wanted to be while he was still sick. That Nicole gave him an ultimatum, not a cold ultimatum, but the kind that comes from love and from terror and from the absolute refusal to watch someone you love destroy themselves. He has said, in various interviews, that checking himself was the hardest and the most important decision of his life. That Nicole didn't just ask him to go. She went with him on the first day, sat with him, left him there, drove away knowing that the man she had just married 4 months ago was in a facility trying to put himself back together again. The guitar was waiting for him on the other side. It always was. The rehabilitation this second time, more intensive, longer, more honest than the first, was the beginning of a different kind of Keith Urban. Not a repaired version of the same person. A genuinely different man. He has spoken about the 12-step program, about the spiritual dimension of recovery, with a quietness and a sincerity that doesn't perform its faith. He doesn't evangelize about it. He simply, clearly attributes his life, the life he has now, the marriage, the children, the continued career, to the decision to do the work of recovery and to keep doing it every day as a practice rather than an event. Sobriety is not a destination for Keith Urban. He has been clear about this. It is a discipline, ongoing, sustained, chosen again every morning. He emerged from Betty Ford in early 2007 and did something that required enormous courage. He went back to work. Not in a tentative, let's see how this goes way. He went back to work with a ferocity that produced some of the best music of his career. The album Love, Pain, and the Whole Crazy Thing had already been released in 2006, just before his check-in, and it contained the extraordinary ballad Once in a Lifetime, a song that sounds, in retrospect, like a man singing directly at the thing he was about to either lose or save. In 2009, Defying Gravity arrived, and it was a statement. It was a man announcing, through music, that the gravity of his own worst impulses had been, if not defeated, at least named, at least confronted, at least refused a permanent residence. Nicole and Keith built a life, a real, layered, private life. In Nashville, with homes also in Los Angeles and Australia. Their daughter Sunday, Rose, was born in 2008. Faith Margaret was born in 2010 via surrogate. 2 children, a family that Keith has spoken about with an uncomplicated, unhesitating love that is its own kind of testimony. He has said, more than once, that fatherhood reorganized everything for him. That when he holds his daughters, when he watches them, he feels something that no stage and no applause and no award has ever produced. Something quieter and more complete. Something he spent decades performing for an audience when it had been available to him all along, if only he had been well enough to accept T58. Keith Urban is not the same man who arrived in Nashville in 1992 with his Australian accent and his extraordinary guitar and his private war. He is not the same man who stood in a rehab facility 4 months after his wedding and made the most important phone call of his life. He is not entirely different, either. The hunger is still there. The restlessness. The absolute refusal to make safe or predictable music. He has continued to evolve in ways that occasionally frustrate country purists, leaning into pop structures, embracing electronic production choices, collaborating with artists from completely different musical worlds. He does not apologize for this. He has talked about music as something alive, something that should move rather than sit still and be preserved under glass. His live performances at 58 retain a physical, kinetic energy that exhausts musicians half his age. He plays the guitar the way some people pray, with his whole body, with something in his eyes that looks like gratitude and ferocity existing in the same moment that he is, at this point in his life, also a man who talks about his faith with the same quiet directness with which he talks about his recovery. Not loudly, not prescriptively, but it is present in almost every serious interview he gives. The acknowledgement that there is something larger than himself at work in his life, something that he could not engineer or control or perform his way into. He has said that recovery taught him the difference between asking for help and admitting defeat. That those two things which he once confused are actually opposites. Asking for help, he has learned, is the bravest thing a person can do. It is the thing that saved his life. The guitar still hangs by his side every night. In every arena, in every television appearance, in every quiet moment backstage that the cameras don't capture. It is, at 58, the same instrument it was when he was 6, the language that makes sense of everything else. He has said, in a way that does not sound poetic, but simply sounds true, that the guitar has been the most consistent relationship of his life. That it has never left him. That even in the darkest years, when he was drinking and using and disappearing into himself, the guitar was there, waiting with a patience that had nothing to do with judgment. Just presence. Just the offer of the next note, whenever he was ready. Now I want to speak to you directly. Not about him. About you. Because you're watching this for a reason. Maybe it's curiosity, or maybe there's something in Keith Urban's story that pulled at something you haven't quite been able to name. The part about performing for approval, since you were too young to understand what approval even was. The part about reaching a dream and then finding, inexplicably, that the dream wasn't enough to fill the hole you'd been trying to fill all along. The part about the person who loved you sitting across from you and saying, quietly, I cannot watch you disappear. The part about checking in somewhere and being taken apart, piece by piece, and rebuilt with your own shaking hands. Maybe one of those parts found you. Maybe all of them did. What Keith Urban's story actually tells us, what the 58 years of it, with all its extraordinary music and its private devastation and its late, hard-earned peace, is that the wound you carried does not have to be the ending. It can be, if you do the terrifying work of looking directly at it, the beginning. Not the beginning of a simpler life. Not the beginning of a life without pain. But the beginning of a life that is actually yours, lived in the actual present, rather than in the performance of a self you built to survive something you were never meant to survive alone. The guitar, for Keith Urban, was always the truest version of himself. The version that existed before the alcohol, before the cocaine, before the fame and the rejection and the years of professional silence. before the wedding and the crisis and the second chance. 6 years old in Queensland, holding an instrument he did not yet know would save his life multiple times. Still saving it at 58. And so here's the question I want to leave you with. Not about him, but about you. What is your guitar? What is the thing you first picked up before the world told you who you were supposed to be? Before you learned to perform and please and earn and survive? What is the language that makes sense of everything else? The one that has been waiting with extraordinary patience for you to find your way back to it. Because it is still there. It has not gone anywhere. And the question of whether you will pick it up again, that is not a question about talent or timing or whether the world is ready for you. It is only a question about whether you are ready to stop disappearing and start showing up for the one life that has your name on it. Think about that. Share this if it found you somewhere real.